When Elias hesitated for 3 seconds on that radio call, 3 men burned alive in the Oregon wilderness. That was 2 years ago. Today, standing over a dying bobcat kitten caught in a steel trap, he faces the same terrible choice. Walk away and protect what's left of his shattered soul, or reach out one more time and risk breaking completely. He pulls the animal from the frozen creek, not knowing that this small act of mercy will unravel everything he thought he knew about guilt, redemption, and what it truly means to save a life. Because sometimes the ones we rescue end up rescuing us. And sometimes the bravest thing a broken creature can do is choose to love again, even when the world has given it every reason not to. This is the story of a man haunted by the dead, a 3-legged bobcat that shouldn't have survived, and a blind wolf waiting to die. 3 shattered souls who will teach each other that healing doesn't mean forgetting the pain. It means finding someone brave enough to carry it with you. What happens when the snowstorm hits and everything they've built together hangs in the balance? What happens when survival means choosing someone else over yourself? And what happens when a man who couldn't save his best friend is given one last chance to get it right? The answer will break your heart. And then it will put it back together in ways you never expected. The storm came down like a judgment. Elias had seen worse in his years fighting fires across the Cascades. But snow had a different kind of cruelty than flames. Fire, at least, moved with purpose. Snow just buried everything until you forgot what lay underneath. He kept his eyes on the logging road, what was left of it. The windshield wipers scraped against ice faster than they cleared it. 3 miles back to the cabin, 3 miles of second-guessing why he'd driven into town at all. The hardware store had what he needed, but towns had people, and people asked questions he'd stopped answering 2 years ago. The truck hit a rut and his coffee went airborne. He swore, grabbed the wheel tighter. That's when he saw the red. Not much of it. Just a few drops on the white. But red enough to make him slow down. Red enough to make him stop, even though every instinct told him to keep driving. He'd learned the hard way that stopping for things in distress only led to more distress. Sometimes you couldn't save what needed saving, and sometimes the trying cost more than the losing. But he stopped anyway. The creek ran alongside the road here, mostly frozen over except where the current pushed through. Elias pulled on his work gloves and climbed out into wind that felt like it had teeth. The snow was already covering his tracks from this morning. By nightfall, no one would know he'd been here at all. That's how he liked it. More blood, a trail of it leading down the embankment. He followed it, his boots breaking through the crust with each step. The sound of the creek got louder, that hollow rushing beneath ice that always sounded like a warning. Then he saw the trap. Steel jaws, the illegal kind that hadn't been used legally in Oregon for decades. Poachers still set them deep in the backcountry where the wardens rarely came. This one sat half submerged in the frozen stream, and clamped in its teeth was something small and spotted and very much alive. A bobcat kitten. Couldn't have been more than 4 months old. Its left front paw was caught, twisted at an angle that made Elias's stomach turn. The animal had tried to chew itself free. The ice around the trap was stained dark where it had bled. The kitten's eyes locked onto his. Not with the wild panic he expected, but something worse. Something that looked like understanding. Like it knew it was dying and had already accepted it. The way prey animals do when the struggle stops making sense. Elias stood there in the wind and the snow, and for a long moment he didn't move. He should call the wildlife center. They had people trained for this, people who knew what they were doing, people who hadn't already failed when it mattered most. The kitten made a sound, not a cry, just a small, rattling breath that barely carried over the wind. He thought about Derek. Derek, who'd trusted him. Derek, who'd followed his orders into the canyon when Elias swore the fire wouldn't jump. Derek, whose last words over the radio were asking if he should stay or run. Elias had hesitated. Just 3 seconds. 3 seconds of trying to read smoke and wind while Derek waited for an answer that came too late. The kitten shivered, or maybe that was shock setting in. Its breathing had gone shallow. In another hour, maybe less, the cold would finish what the trap had started. Nature had a way of being efficient about these things. He took a step back toward the truck, then stopped, took another step, stopped again. The animal's eyes never left him. Elias closed his eyes and made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. When he opened them again, he was already moving down the bank, already pulling the multi-tool from his belt, already breaking the promise he'd made to himself about staying uninvolved. The water was cold enough to stop his heart. He could feel it through his boots, through his jeans. The kitten tried to pull away when he reached for the trap, but it didn't have the strength. Up close, he could see how young it really was, how the winter had already worn it down to bone and will. The trap was old, but it held. Elias worked the release mechanism with fingers that had gone clumsy in the cold. Once, twice. The third time, something gave. The jaws opened and the kitten collapsed into the water, too weak to even try to escape. He grabbed it without thinking. The animal's fur was soaked through, its body temperature probably already critical. It should have fought him. Should have clawed and bit and done everything a wild thing does when cornered. Instead, it just lay there in his arms, shaking so hard he could feel it in his chest. Elias looked back up at his truck, at the sensible world where he minded his own business and let nature handle itself. Then he looked down at the small, broken thing he was holding, at the way it had stopped shivering, which was worse than the shivering had been. He started climbing. The Cascade Hope Wildlife Rehabilitation Center sat 23 miles from where Elias had found the kitten. He made it in 17 minutes, though he couldn't remember most of the drive. The truck's heater was cranked to maximum, but the small body wrapped in his jacket hadn't moved since mile 5. He'd felt for a heartbeat at the last stoplight. Found one. Barely. The center was a converted barn surrounded by chain-link enclosures, most of them empty this time of year. A handmade sign creaked in the wind. Elias had driven past it 100 times in 2 years and never once pulled in. Now he was carrying something dying through its doors, and the irony wasn't lost on him. A woman in her 60s looked up from the front desk. Her name tag said volunteer, but her eyes said she'd seen enough suffering to know the difference between urgent and already gone. She reached for the phone before Elias even opened his mouth. "Exam 3, she said. "Dr. Chen's on call. How long's it been in the cold?" "Don't know. Hour, maybe more before I found it." Elias followed her down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and cedar shavings. Legs caught in a trap, lost a lot of blood. The exam room was small and too bright. Dr. Chen was younger than Elias expected, with steady hands and a face that had learned not to show what she was thinking. She took the kitten from him and laid it on a steel table under a heat lamp. "Bobcat," she said, not a question. Her fingers moved over the small body, checking vitals that Elias knew weren't there to check. She pulled a thermometer from the drawer and placed it carefully. Waited. Looked at the reading and put it down without commenting. "We need to warm it slowly," she said. "Too fast and the heart stops. Too slow and it won't matter." She glanced at Elias. "This animal is about as close to gone as it gets. You understand that?" He understood. He'd understood in the creek. He'd understood in the truck. Understanding didn't change what he'd already decided. Dr. Chen worked quickly, setting up an IV line that looked impossibly large against the kitten's leg. The injured paw was worse than Elias had thought, the bones crushed in a way that meant amputation if the animal even survived. Another tech came in with heated blankets and oxygen, and for a while the room was all movement and medical shorthand that Elias couldn't follow. Then Dr. Chen stopped. She looked at the monitor that was barely registering a pulse, looked at her watch, looked at Elias. "I'm sorry," she said. "We've done what we can. The hypothermia is too severe. Even if we get the temperature up, the organ damage at this point." She trailed off. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let them go. Elias stared at the kitten on the table. It looked even smaller under the harsh lights, its spotted coat matted and dark with blood. One of its eyes was open just a crack, not seeing anything, maybe not seeing anything ever again. "There's another way," he said. Dr. Chen waited. "Body heat, direct contact. I've heard of it working with hypothermia victims." Elias kept his voice level. "Human body temperature is higher than what you can get with blankets, if someone stays with it, skin to skin, for long enough. That's for humans," Dr. Chen said carefully. "And even then, it's risky. You're talking about hours, 6, maybe more. No guarantee it works, and if it doesn't, you've just prolonged." "I'll do it." The doctor studied him. Whatever she saw in his face made her decision for her. She nodded once. "Room 4 has a cot. I'll need to monitor every hour. If the heart rate drops below 30, we stop. Agreed?" "Agreed." Room 4 was barely large enough for the cot and a folding chair. The walls were cinder block painted pale blue, and a single window looked out at the snow still falling. Dr. Chen brought the kitten in, wrapped loosely in a towel, the IV line trailing. "Shirt off," she said. "Hold it against your chest. Not too tight. You're providing warmth, not pressure." She showed him how to position the small body. "Talk if you want. Some people think it helps. Mostly just don't fall asleep. If something changes, you call for me. Understood?" Elias nodded. She left, closing the door behind her. He settled onto the cot and carefully arranged the kitten against his skin. It was like holding ice wrapped in fur. No movement, no response. Just a tiny body that weighed almost nothing and might already be past saving. The first hour was the worst. Elias kept his hand on the kitten's ribs, feeling for breath that came too shallow and too slow. He counted heartbeats when he could find them. Lost count. Started over. The room was silent except for the storm outside and the small, desperate sound of something trying to stay alive. He thought about Derek again. Couldn't help it. Derek, who'd had a wife and a kid and a whole life waiting for him outside the fire season. Derek, who died because Elias froze when he should have acted. 3 seconds. That's all it had taken to turn a life into a memory and a burden Elias would carry until his own heart stopped. The kitten's breathing changed, got weaker. Elias held it closer, willing his own warmth into a body that didn't know him, didn't trust him, didn't have any reason to fight. But it was fighting anyway. He could feel it in the tiny movements, the way the lungs kept trying even when trying seemed pointless. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, kid. Don't quit now." Hour 2. The thermometer showed 92 degrees. Still dangerously low, still not enough. Dr. Chen came in, checked the vitals, adjusted the IV. She didn't say anything, but her expression said what words couldn't. This was a long shot that kept getting longer. Hour 3, 94 degrees. The kitten made a sound, the first one since the creek. It wasn't much. Just a small breath that caught and held. But it was something. Elias felt his own breathing sync with it. In, out, in, out. 2 hearts in a small room. Both of them damaged. Both of them refusing to quit. By hour 4, the snow had stopped. By hour 5, Elias could feel the kitten's body temperature rising, could sense something shifting in the way it lay against him. Not consciousness, not yet, but not dying either. Something in between. Hour 6. The door opened. Dr. Chen came in with her thermometer and stethoscope. She worked quietly, her face unreadable. Then she stepped back. 97.8, she said. Heart rate 53, breathing steady. She looked at Elias with something that might have been surprise or might have been respect. I don't know how you did it, but you did. Elias looked down at the small, broken thing in his arms. Its eyes were still closed, its body still too thin. But it was warm now. It was breathing. It was alive. Now what? He asked. Dr. Chen's expression shifted. Now we see if it wants to live. They named the kitten Atlas. Dr. Chen said it was because of what it carried, all that weight of survival on such small shoulders. Elias thought it was just a name, but he didn't argue. Names had a way of making things real, and he wasn't sure he wanted this to be real yet. Atlas survived the first night, then the second. By the 3rd day, the infection in its leg had responded to antibiotics, and the amputation Dr. Chen had warned about became a maybe instead of a certainty. The kitten's body was healing. Everything else had shut down. It sat in the corner of its enclosure, back pressed against the cinder block wall, and stared at nothing. Not at the food bowl Dr. Chen left, not at the water, not at the volunteers who came and went with their soft voices and careful hands. Just at some point in the middle distance, where nothing existed except whatever horror played behind its eyes. Psychological shutdown, Dr. Chen explained on day 4. We see it sometimes with trauma cases. The body survives, but the mind checks out. It's a protection mechanism. Sometimes they come back from it, sometimes they don't. Elias stood outside the enclosure, watching the small, motionless shape. How long? Could be days, could be weeks, could be never. She handed him a clipboard with feeding charts and medication schedules. We'll keep trying, force feeding if we have to. But honestly, if it doesn't want to live, there's not much we can do. He'd heard those words before. Different context, same meaning. Want wasn't always enough. But sometimes it was all you had. That afternoon, Elias did something he couldn't quite explain. Instead of leaving, he pulled up a folding chair outside Atlas's enclosure and sat down. Didn't try to coax the kitten closer. Didn't talk to it. Just sat there while the weak winter sun came through the high windows and made patterns on the concrete floor. He came back the next day, and the day after that. On the 3rd visit, he brought his toolbox. The center's volunteer coordinator, a woman named Linda who smiled too much, had mentioned they needed repair work on the wooden perches in the recovery aviaries. Elias figured he could do that. Figured he could do it right here, where Atlas could see him if it ever decided to look. He worked quietly, sanding down rough edges, replacing worn bolts, letting the familiar rhythm of the work settle his hands. The rasp of sandpaper on wood, the smell of fresh-cut pine, small sounds that filled the silence without demanding anything from it. Atlas didn't move, didn't eat, didn't acknowledge his presence, but it didn't die either. A week passed, then another. The volunteers started talking about him, the strange man who showed up every afternoon and sat outside an enclosure doing woodwork while a traumatized bobcat pretended he didn't exist. Linda asked him once why he kept coming. "Don't know," Elias said, which was true and also not true. He knew. He just didn't have words for it that wouldn't sound like he'd lost his mind. The thing was, Atlas reminded him of himself. Not in any way he could explain to someone else, but in the way the kitten had retreated so far inside itself that the world couldn't touch it anymore. Elias understood that, had lived that, was still living it in the cabin 3 miles from town where nobody asked questions and nobody expected answers. He'd learned to function, go through the motions, buy groceries, fix things that broke, exist without actually being present. Atlas was doing the same thing, only it didn't have the luxury of pretending. Its shutdown was visible, honest. Elias's was just better hidden. In the 3rd week, something changed. Elias was working on a nest box, measuring twice because old habits died hard when he felt it. That prickle on the back of his neck that meant something was watching. He looked up slowly. Atlas had moved. Not much. Just shifted position so it faced the enclosure door instead of the wall. Its eyes were still distant, still fixed on that place where nothing lived. But the angle was different. The space between them felt different. Elias went back to his measuring, marked the wood, cut carefully along the line. When he looked up again, Atlas hadn't moved. But something had shifted in the quality of its stillness. Less like stone, more like waiting. He worked until the lights started to fade, packed up his tools, stood to leave. And for just a moment, he could have sworn Atlas's eyes tracked the movement. Brief, almost imperceptible. But there. "See you tomorrow," Elias said to the empty air. The next day, he brought a piece of half-finished work. Something that would take hours. Something that would keep him there longer. Atlas was in the same position, but its eyes were open wider. Still not looking at him. Still not there. But less gone than before. Elias set up his work. Let the silence settle. After a while, he started talking. Not to Atlas. Not really. Just thinking out loud the way he used to when he worked alone in the woods, before the fire, before Derek, before everything went to hell. "Had a friend once who couldn't shut up," he said, running his hand over the wood grain. "Drove me crazy on long shifts, always talking, music, sports, his kids' baseball games. I used to tell him to save his breath." He paused. "Turns out silence is worse. Turns out you miss the noise when it's gone." Atlas's ear flicked. Just once. So quick Elias almost missed it. But he didn't miss it. He kept talking, kept working. And somewhere in the space between words and silence, between two broken things that didn't know how to be whole anymore, something began to build. Not healing. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. Maybe the first crack in the glass wall that kept the world at a distance, where it couldn't hurt. Outside, the Oregon winter held on. Inside, 2 survivors sat in the same room and breathed the same air and didn't run from each other. It wasn't much, but it was something. Martha arrived on a Tuesday, when the morning light came through the windows at an angle that made everything look softer than it was. Elias didn't hear her approach, didn't know she was there until her voice cut through the quiet, like she'd been listening to his thoughts. "You're using that animal as penance." He looked up from the birdhouse he'd been staining. An older woman stood near the doorway, one hand on a white cane, the other holding a thermos that probably contained coffee. Her eyes had the milky quality of someone who'd lost their sight years ago. But the way she tilted her head suggested she saw more than most people with perfect vision. "I'm sorry," Elias said. "No, you're not. Not yet, anyway." Martha moved into the room with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every step. She settled onto a bench near the wall, unscrewed the thermos, and poured herself a cup. Been volunteering here for 12 years. Heard about you from Linda. Man who sits outside an enclosure every day doing carpentry while a broken bobcat pretends he doesn't exist. That's either love or guilt. And you don't have the look of someone in love. Elias turned back to his work. Don't know what you're talking about? Sure you don't. Martha took a sip of her coffee. I lost my sight in a car accident 23 years ago. My husband was driving. He walked away without a scratch. Died of a heart attack 2 years later because he couldn't forgive himself for something that wasn't his fault. She paused. Guilt's like that. Kills you slow if you let it. The stain brush felt heavy in Elias's hand. He'd been coming here for 4 weeks. 4 weeks of silence and woodwork and waiting for Atlas to decide if living was worth the effort. Nobody had asked him why. Nobody had pushed. He'd started to think maybe nobody would. I don't need a therapy session, he said. Didn't offer one, just making conversation. Martha's voice was steady, without judgment. That kitten, though, it's stuck. You can feel it, can't you? How it's trapped somewhere between fighting and giving up. How every day it chooses neither, just exists in that gray space where nothing touches it. Elias's hand had stopped moving. He stared at Atlas in the corner, at the small shape that hadn't shifted position in days. You recognize it, Martha continued, because you're in the same place. Different walls, same cage. The words hit harder than they should have. Elias set down the brush. His hands weren't steady anymore. There was a fire, he heard himself say. Hadn't planned to tell anyone, ever. But the words came anyway, like something that had been building pressure too long. 3 years ago, wildfire season, Oregon-California border. My crew was doing containment work on the north flank. Martha didn't move, didn't interrupt, just listened in the way only blind people seem to know how, with their whole body. We had a rookie that year, Derek, 26, smart kid, former Marine. Followed orders, kept his head down, never took unnecessary risks. Elias's voice had gone flat. The fire jumped a ridge we thought was secure, split the crew. Derek and 2 others got caught on the wrong side. The memory came back sharp enough to taste. Smoke, radio static. Derek's voice asking what to do while the fire crowned out behind him. I was incident commander. Radio check came in. Derek wanted to know if they should stay put or try to make it to the safety zone. The book says stay put, wait for the shift. But I'd seen the wind patterns, knew the fire was going to roll right over their position. Elias's jaw clenched. He asked me what to do, and I hesitated. 3 seconds, maybe 4, trying to calculate odds that couldn't be calculated, trying to make a call that didn't have a right answer. Martha's coffee had gone still in her hands. By the time I told him to move, the window had closed. Fire took them before they made it 50 yards. Derek, Martinez, Chen. The names felt like stones in his mouth. 3 people dead because I couldn't make a decision fast enough. The silence that followed felt like something physical. Elias realized his hands were shaking. Realized he'd said out loud what he'd never said before, not to the investigators, not to the counselors they'd sent after, not to anyone. So, now you sit here, Martha said quietly, trying to save something you couldn't save before, trying to rewrite an ending that's already written. Elias looked at Atlas, at the small, broken thing that didn't know him, didn't trust him, didn't have any reason to let him help. Something like that. That animal doesn't need your guilt. It needs your presence. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Martha stood, feeling her way to the door with her cane. Guilt keeps you separate, keeps you safe from actually connecting, because if you don't connect, you can't fail again. But that kitten, it doesn't need your distance. It needs someone who understands what it's like to survive something that maybe you shouldn't have. She paused at the doorway. Stop using it as a mirror for your pain. Start seeing it as its own thing, something that deserves saving, not because it absolves you, but because it deserves it. Then she was gone. Elias sat in the quiet that followed. His confession hung in the air like smoke. He felt raw, exposed, like he'd torn open something that should have stayed sealed. His eyes burned, his chest ached, and for the first time in 3 years, he let himself feel the full weight of what he'd lost, what he'd cost, what he couldn't take back. A small sound pulled his attention back. Atlas had moved. Not much. Not. Just enough to face the enclosure door instead of the wall. Its eyes, usually distant and unfocused, had fixed on something. On him. Elias stood slowly. Approached the glass. The kitten didn't retreat. Didn't shut down. Just watched him with an intensity that felt like recognition. He placed his hand flat against the cold glass. That's all. And Atlas, after a moment that stretched like hours, rose on 3 legs and limped forward. Each step looked like it cost something. Each step looked like a choice. The kitten reached the glass and stopped. Then, deliberately, it lifted its injured paw, the one that was scarred and healing wrong, and placed it against the glass where Elias's hand pressed from the other side. 2 survivors, 2 sets of scars, a pane of glass between them that felt thinner than it had a moment ago. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. And in that moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with guilt or redemption or any of the words Martha had used. Just recognition. Just 2 broken things, acknowledging they weren't alone in being broken. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a crow called. Inside, the world felt different than it had 10 minutes ago. Not fixed, not healed, but less shattered than before. Dr. Chen called it exposure therapy. Elias called it a risk they couldn't afford to take. Atlas had just started eating on its own, had just started acknowledging the world existed beyond the glass. Pushing it into the outdoor recovery yard seemed like asking for regression, like undoing weeks of fragile progress in a single afternoon. But Chen had a point. Atlas couldn't live in that enclosure forever. Wild animals needed space, needed sky, needed something beyond concrete walls and recycled air. The kitten's body had healed enough. Its mind was the problem now, and minds didn't heal in cages. "We'll go slow," Chen said. "Just an hour. Supervised. If it shuts down again, we bring it back inside." Elias wanted to argue. Wanted to say it was too soon, that Atlas wasn't ready, that they should wait another week, another month, whatever it took to be sure. But he looked at the kitten in its enclosure, at how it had started pacing the perimeter like something trapped. And he knew Chen was right. Staying safe meant staying small. Atlas needed more than that. The outdoor yard was 50 feet by 30, surrounded by high fencing and covered with netting to keep birds from escaping. A few evergreen boughs provided cover. A water feature trickled in the corner. It looked peaceful. It looked like the kind of place a healing animal should want to be. Atlas took one look at the open space and froze. They'd brought it out in a carrier, set it down, opened the door. The kitten didn't move, just crouched at the entrance with its ears flat, every muscle locked, breathing too fast. The yard might as well have been a canyon, The sky might as well have been falling. Give it time, Chen murmured. They gave it 20 minutes. Atlas didn't budge. Its eyes had that distant look again, that 1,000-yard stare Elias recognized from his own mirror. Too much space, too much exposure, too much world all at once. Chen was about to call it when Martha appeared from the main building, moving with her cane in one hand and a leash in the other. At the end of the leash was something Elias had heard about but never seen. A wolf, old, gray around the muzzle, moving with the careful steps of something that had lost its confidence along with its sight. "This is Ghost," Martha said. "Been here 6 months. Rescued from a breeding facility that went bankrupt. Handlers kept him in a concrete cell for 8 years. Lost his vision from untreated glaucoma. Lost his will to live shortly after." The wolf sat when Martha stopped, its head low, its body language speaking of defeat so complete it had become a permanent state. Ghost's eyes were clouded white, pupils barely visible. It didn't look at anything because it couldn't see anything. Didn't react to sounds, didn't care about the world it could no longer navigate. "He's dying," Martha said plainly. "Not from disease, from giving up. We've tried everything, different enclosures, music, company from other animals. Nothing works. He just sits and waits for it to be over." "Why bring him here?" Elias asked. "Because sometimes broken things understand each other better than whole things ever could." Martha unclipped the leash. "Sometimes healing isn't about fixing what's damaged. It's about finding someone who shares the damage." She walked away, leaving Ghost standing in the middle of the yard like a statue of something that had forgotten how to move. For a long moment, nothing happened. Atlas stayed frozen in the carrier doorway. Ghost stood motionless in the center of the yard. Two animals locked in their own separate hells, unable or unwilling to bridge the distance between them. Then Ghost took a step, a tentative, uncertain step toward where the water feature trickled. His head was up, nose testing the air, but his movement was all wrong. He walked like someone expecting the ground to disappear beneath him, like someone who'd learned that moving forward only led to walls and pain. He veered left, would have walked straight into the fence if he'd kept going. He stopped, turned, tried another direction. His confusion was palpable, heartbreaking. Here was an animal that had once run through forests, that had known terrain by instinct and sight, reduced to stumbling through a 50-foot yard like it was an endless maze. Atlas made a sound. Not a growl, not a cry. Just a small, sharp chirp that bobcats make when they're startled or curious. The kind of sound that meant attention, meant focus here, meant something. Ghost's ears swiveled. He turned toward the carrier, toward Atlas, but his movements were uncertain. He took a step, then another. Not toward the kitten, just in a slightly different direction than before. Atlas chirped again. Different pitch this time. Higher, more insistent. Ghost adjusted his path. Elias felt his breath catch. He looked at Chen. She was watching with the same intensity, the same disbelief. The kitten limped out of the carrier. 3 legs, still awkward, still recovering. It moved maybe 5 feet into the yard, then stopped and made another sound. This one was longer, more complex. Not quite a trill, not quite a call. Something in between. Ghost turned toward it, took 2 steps, stopped when his nose touched the water bowl he'd been trying to find. "Jesus," Chen whispered. Atlas was guiding him, using sound the way a spotter uses words, giving direction through tone and pitch and rhythm. The kitten, barely healed, barely functional, had found something it could do. Someone it could help. A purpose that wasn't about its own survival, but about someone else's. For the next hour, they watched something neither of them would have believed if they hadn't seen it. Atlas slowly, carefully, began to map the yard for Ghost. Each time the wolf moved, the kitten adjusted position, making small sounds that told the wolf where obstacles were, where open space existed, where safety could be found. It wasn't perfect. Ghost still stumbled, still showed fear. But there was something different in the way he moved now. Less defeated, more willing to try. And Atlas, the kitten that had been shut down and unreachable for weeks, was fully present, fully engaged, fully alive in a way it hadn't been since the trap. By the time they brought both animals back inside, Ghost was walking with more confidence. And Atlas, instead of retreating to the corner of its enclosure, sat near the glass and watched the hallway, waiting, like something in it had remembered what it meant to matter. Chen stood next to Elias in the observation room, both of them still processing what they'd witnessed. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, she said. Never seen anything like that. Elias thought about Derek, about how saving people had been his job, his purpose, the thing that defined him, about how losing that purpose had been worse than losing the life that came with it, about how Atlas had just found something to live for that wasn't about its own pain. "Neither have I," he said. Martha's voice came from behind them, soft but certain. "The broken ones always know. They recognize each other. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they save each other in ways the whole ones never could." Outside, night was coming on. Inside, two damaged creatures had found a reason to keep trying. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was hope. And sometimes hope was enough to start with. Sarah Winters arrived on a Thursday morning with a clipboard and the kind of expression that suggested she'd already made her decisions before walking through the door. She was young for a wildlife inspector, maybe 35, with the crisp professionalism of someone who'd learned early that sentiment had no place in conservation work. Dr. Chen met her in the main office. Elias was in the recovery yard with Atlas and Ghost, watching the unlikely pair navigate their morning routine. He didn't know Sarah was there until Linda came out, her usual smile replaced with something that looked like worry. "There's an inspector here. From the State Wildlife Department. She's asking about Atlas." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. "What does she want?" "I don't know. But Dr. Chen looks worried." He found them in Chen's office, papers spread across the desk. Sarah looked up when he entered, her eyes doing a quick assessment that told him she'd already decided what kind of person he was. "Mr. Brennan, I've heard you're quite attached to the Bobcat." Not a question. An observation delivered like evidence. "I found it. Helped it survive. Yeah, I'm invested." Sarah made a note on her clipboard. "That's part of the problem. The animal shows significant habituation to human contact. Dr. Chen's reports indicate it responds preferentially to your presence, shows comfort-seeking behavior around people, and has formed an unusual bond with a captive wolf. These are all indicators of an animal that cannot successfully return to the wild." "It's healing," Elias said. "Give it time." Time won't change the fundamental issue. Bobcats are solitary, territorial predators. This animal's natural behaviors have been compromised by extended human contact during a critical developmental period. Release would be a death sentence. It doesn't have the skills to hunt, to avoid humans, to survive. Dr. Chen leaned forward. "We've discussed a long-term rehabilitation protocol. Reduced human contact, prey training, gradual reintroduction to wild behaviors, which would take months, possibly years, with no guarantee of success. Sarah's voice was flat, factual. The department's position is clear. Non-releasable wildlife must either remain in permanent educational captivity at an accredited facility or be humanely euthanized. Given the animal's age and relative health, euthanasia would be inappropriate. Therefore, I'm recommending transfer to Cascade Wildlife Park. The name hit Elias like a fist. Cascade Wildlife Park wasn't a rehabilitation center. It was a roadside zoo, the kind of place that charged admission to see animals in concrete enclosures, where kids threw popcorn at bored predators and tourists took selfies with suffering. No. The word came out harder than he intended. That's not happening. Sarah's expression didn't change. It's not your decision, Mr. Brennan. The animal is property of the state. My recommendation will be reviewed by the regional director, but I can tell you from experience, it will be approved. Transfer is scheduled for next Monday. 5 days, Chen said quietly. Sarah, that's barely enough time to make arrangements, which is all that's required. Sarah stood, gathering her papers. I understand this is difficult, but our job is to make decisions based on science and policy, not emotion. This animal's best chance at a decent life is in a facility designed for permanent captives. Elias felt his hands clench. Best chance? Have you seen that place? Animals pacing in circles, concrete and chain link. That's not a life. That's a cage with a different name. It's a licensed facility that meets all state requirements. Requirements. Right. Elias's voice had gone quiet in a way that made Chen look at him sharply. So, you're telling me Atlas survives a trap that should have killed it? Survives hypothermia, survives psychological trauma, starts finding a way to live again. And the reward is spending the rest of its life behind glass while people gawk at it. I'm telling you the animal is not viable for release. The alternatives are limited. Then find more alternatives. Sarah's patience, which had been thin to start with, cracked. Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your concern, but you're emotionally compromised. You see an animal you saved. I see an animal that's been irreparably damaged by human contact. My job is to make the hard calls based on reality, not sentiment. Reality, Elias repeated. He thought about Derek, about hard calls made too slow, about reality that didn't care what you felt or what you wanted or what you thought was right. And if I fight this, then you'll lose and waste everyone's time in the process. Sarah moved toward the door. Transfer is Monday at 10 a.m. I suggest you use the next few days to say your goodbyes. She left. The office felt smaller without her, the air heavier. Chen looked at Elias with something that might have been sympathy or might have been resignation. She's not wrong about the regulations, Chen said carefully. A habituated bobcat is a liability. If we released it and it approached humans, got hit by a car, raided chicken coops, so we give up. Lock it away. Pretend that's mercy. I didn't say I agreed with her. I said she's not wrong about the rules. Elias stood there, feeling the weight of every decision he'd made that led to this moment. He'd pulled Atlas from that trap thinking he was saving it. Maybe he'd just traded one cage for another. Maybe Martha was right and he'd been using the kitten as penance all along, and now his attempt at redemption had doomed it to something worse than death. There has to be another way, he said. If there is, we have 5 days to find it. 5 days. 120 hours to prove that a damaged animal could still be whole. To prove that broken didn't mean useless. to prove that surviving meant something more than just breathing. Elias walked back to the recovery yard. Atlas was curled next to Ghost, both of them resting in a patch of weak sunlight. The kitten's eyes tracked his approach. Trusting, calm, not knowing that in 5 days this small piece would end. He'd failed Derek by hesitating. He couldn't fail Atlas by giving up. Somewhere between that thought and the next breath, Elias made a decision that probably made no sense, that violated every rule about emotional distance and practical thinking. He was going to fight. And if fighting meant breaking rules, bending laws, or standing between Atlas and every bureaucrat who valued policy over life, then that's what he'd do. The kitten deserved that much. They all did. Sunday night came too fast. Tomorrow at 10, a van from Cascade Wildlife Park would arrive. Tomorrow, Atlas would leave this place and never come back. Tomorrow, the small progress, the fragile healing, the quiet moments of connection would all be reduced to a file in Sarah Winter's office marked Case Closed. Elias couldn't sleep. Didn't even try. At midnight, he drove to the center through darkness that felt heavier than it should. The building was locked, but he had Linda's spare key. She'd given it to him 3 days ago without explanation, just pressed it into his hand and said sometimes rules needed bending. The hallways were dark except for emergency lights. His footsteps echoed too loud in the silence. He moved through the building like someone saying goodbye to a home he'd been evicted from. Touching walls, memorizing the layout, trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. The recovery ward was at the back. Atlas's enclosure sat in the corner. And Elias expected to find the kitten alone, maybe sleeping, maybe awake and staring at nothing the way it used to. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. Atlas and Ghost were lying together. Not just near each other, but intertwined. The wolf's massive body curled protectively around the small Bobcat, and Atlas had tucked itself against Ghost's chest, right where the heartbeat would be strongest. Their breathing had synchronized. In, out, in, out. 2 damaged creatures sharing warmth in the darkness, creating between them something that looked like peace. Elias's throat tightened. He'd seen a lot in his years fighting fires, rescuing people, pulling victims from situations that shouldn't have had survivors. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. The intimacy of it, the trust, the way they fit together like pieces that had been broken from the same whole. He understood then what Sarah Winters didn't, what the regulations couldn't account for. Atlas wasn't just a habituated bobcat. It was a creature that had learned to see beyond itself, to connect, to care about something other than its own survival. That wasn't a deficit. That was evolution. That was what separated existing from living. And they wanted to put it in a concrete box where tourists could point and take pictures and move on to the next exhibit. Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not anger, something colder, something more dangerous. Determination. The kind of clarity that came when you finally stopped hesitating and committed to a decision, consequences be damned. He moved closer to the enclosure. Atlas's ear flicked, but it didn't wake. Ghost's breathing never changed. They trusted this space, trusted the safety of these walls. Tomorrow that trust would be betrayed, and there wasn't a damn thing either of them could do about it. Unless someone did it for them. The thought formed slowly, piece by piece. Sarah had said Atlas couldn't survive in the wild. Said it lacked the instincts, the skills, the necessary behaviors. But what if she was wrong? What if, given the right circumstance, the right challenge, Atlas could prove it still had what it took? The regulations were clear. Non-releasable meant permanent captivity, but releasable meant freedom. The gap between those 2 words was everything. and the only way to cross that gap was to demonstrate wild behavior. Hunting, evasion, independence. Things a truly habituated animal couldn't fake. Elias's mind started working through possibilities. None of them were good. All of them were risky. Most of them would probably fail and make everything worse. But doing nothing guaranteed Atlas would spend the rest of its life in a cage. And Elias had learned the hard way that some failures were worse than others. He thought about Derek again, about hesitation, about how waiting for the perfect answer meant missing the only answer that mattered. 3 seconds. That's what it had cost. 3 seconds of trying to be certain when certainty was impossible. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "I don't know if this is going to work," he said quietly to the sleeping animals. "Don't know if it's even the right thing to try. But I can't let them take you to that place. Can't stand by and watch while they lock you away like some kind of exhibit. You deserve better than that." Atlas stirred slightly. Its eyes opened, reflecting the dim emergency light. The kitten looked at him with an expression that might have been trust or might have been something else entirely. Whatever it was, it felt like permission, like understanding, like a shared acknowledgement that sometimes the only choice left was the impossible one. Elias pressed his hand against the glass one more time. Atlas didn't move to meet it. Didn't need to. The connection was already there, had been since the creek, since the 6 hours of borrowed breath, since the moment they'd both decided survival was worth the cost. "Tomorrow's going to be hard," Elias said, "for both of us. But I need you to trust me. One more time, can you do that?" The kitten blinked slowly, then settled back against Ghost's warmth and closed its eyes. The wolf's tail moved slightly, a small sweep that might have been comfort or might have been sleep. Either way, it spoke of something these two had that most creatures never found: partnership, purpose, a reason to keep trying. Elias left the way he came, through dark hallways and locked doors, out into a night that felt different than when he'd entered. He had maybe 10 hours to figure out a plan that would probably get him in serious trouble and might not even work. 10 hours to gamble everything on the slim chance that a damaged Bobcat could prove it was more than the sum of its scars. The drive back to his cabin took 15 minutes. He spent all of it thinking. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he had the outline of something that might work. It was reckless. It was probably illegal. It definitely violated every protocol Sarah Winters believed in. But it was a chance. And sometimes a chance was all you got. He looked up at the stars, at the vast Oregon sky that didn't care about regulations or paperwork or the small dramas of broken men and damaged animals. Somewhere out there, Derek's ashes were scattered across a ridge where the fire had taken him. Somewhere closer, Atlas was sleeping next to a blind wolf, both of them unaware that tomorrow would change everything. Elias made a decision. Not the safe one, not the smart one, but the only one he could live with. He was going to give Atlas a chance to prove Sarah wrong, even if it meant risking everything he'd worked to build here. Even if it meant facing consequences he couldn't predict. Because some things were worth fighting for. Some connections were worth defending. And some animals deserved better than a cage, no matter what the regulations said. The storm was coming. But this time, Elias wouldn't hesitate. This time, he'd be ready. The weather service had been wrong before, but never like this. What they'd called a moderate snow event turned into something else entirely around 3 in the morning. By dawn, when Elias arrived at the center, 18 inches had already fallen, and the wind was hitting speeds that bent trees double. He'd planned to talk to Dr. Chen, to propose his idea about giving Atlas a chance to demonstrate wild behavior before the transfer. It was desperate, probably foolish, but it was something. Instead, he found the center in crisis mode. "Power's out," Linda said, meeting him at the door with a flashlight. "Backup generator's running, but it won't last forever. Chen's trying to move the critical cases to the main building. The recovery ward's losing heat fast." Elias didn't ask permission, just headed straight for where he knew Atlas and Ghost would be. The hallways were colder than they should be, and he could hear the wind screaming through gaps in the old barn structure. This building had stood for 60 years, but it had never been designed for animals, had never been meant to be anything more than storage. The recovery ward was chaos. Volunteers were moving carriers, trying to consolidate animals into the warmest areas. Dr. Chen was directing traffic, her calm professionalism starting to show cracks. Atlas and Ghost were still in their enclosure, both awake, both agitated. The kitten was pacing. The wolf had his ears back, sensing something wrong in a way that went beyond what his blind eyes could register. "We need to move them," Elias said. Chen looked at him, then at the window, where the storm was turning the world white. Moving a traumatized bobcat and a blind wolf in this weather. A sound like a gunshot cut her off. Not a gunshot, wood cracking. Somewhere above them, the roof was giving way under the weight of snow it was never meant to hold. "Everyone out," Chen shouted. "Main building, now. Leave the carriers, just go." The volunteers moved fast, but not fast enough. Another crack, this one louder. Then a sound like the world splitting open. Part of the roof caved in at the far end of the ward, and suddenly there was snow pouring through, wind howling in, chaos where order had been seconds before. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, dim and insufficient. Through the murk and the snow, Elias could see the collapse had hit the far enclosures. Could hear animals crying out in panic and pain. Could see wooden support beams hanging at angles that meant more was coming down. "Elias," Chen's voice, "we have to go. Building's not stable." He looked at Atlas and Ghost. The kitten had flattened against the floor, every instinct telling it to hide from danger it couldn't escape. The wolf was standing, head up, nostrils flared, trying to understand a threat he couldn't see or navigate. Another crack, more ceiling coming down, this time closer. "Get everyone to safety," Elias said. "I'll get these two. There's no time. Then I'll be fast." Chen hesitated, then grabbed his arm, her grip desperate. "Don't be a hero. Don't you dare." But she was already moving toward the exit, already hurting the last volunteer ahead of her, because staying meant everyone dying, and she knew it. Elias went for Ghost first. The wolf was easier to move, despite the size, already conditioned to follow human direction. He got a lead on him, started guiding him toward the door. Ghost moved reluctantly, every step uncertain, but he moved. They made it 10 feet before the next section came down. It happened fast. 1 second, Elias was pulling Ghost forward. The next, the world was timber and snow and impact. Something hit his shoulder, drove him to his knees. He kept his grip on the lead, kept Ghost moving, got him through the door into the hallway where Chen was waiting. "Atlas," Elias gasped. "Still in there. The building's coming down. You can't." He was already moving back, into the ward where the air had turned white with snow and dust, where visibility was maybe 5 feet and dropping, where the sounds of wood breaking and metal tearing said this whole section was minutes from complete collapse. Atlas's enclosure was across the room. Through the storm inside the building, Elias could barely see it, couldn't tell if it was still standing. Couldn't tell if the kitten was alive or already buried under debris. He moved forward, using his hands to guide him when his eyes couldn't. Found the enclosure. Found it crushed under a fallen beam, the chain link twisted and torn. And underneath, barely visible in the emergency lighting, a small shape that wasn't moving. Atlas was pinned, not by the beam itself, but by sheet metal that had peeled off the ceiling and landed across the enclosure. The kitten was conscious, its eyes wide with terror, but it couldn't move, couldn't escape, could only wait for the next piece of roof to fall and finish what the trap had started months ago. "I've got you," Elias said, knowing the words meant nothing to a terrified animal but needing to say them anyway. "I've got you." He grabbed the metal. It was heavier than it looked, awkward, edges sharp enough to cut. His hands were already numb from cold. The shoulder that had taken the hit earlier wasn't working right. But he pulled, strained, felt something in his back protest and ignored it. The metal shifted. Not much, maybe 6 inches, but enough. Atlas didn't bolt, didn't use the opening to run for freedom. Instead it turned, looked past Elias, and made a sound he'd never heard it make before. Desperate, urgent, not fear for itself, but something else entirely. Elias turned. Ghost was there. The blind wolf had come back, had somehow found his way through the chaos and collapse, drawn by Atlas's distress or by instinct or by something neither human understanding nor animal logic could fully explain. But he was in the wrong place, standing directly under a section of roof that was sagging, creaking, seconds from dropping. And Atlas knew it. Knew in the way prey animals know when predators are close. Knew in the way creatures who'd learned to see for each other understood danger the other couldn't perceive. Time stretched. Elias could pull the metal free, could grab Atlas and run. Could save the one he'd come for and let the wolf take its chances. Could make the choice that made sense, that maximized survival, that any rational person would make. Or he could do something else. He released the metal, lunged for Ghost, grabbed the wolf's collar and pulled hard, throwing his full weight backward. They went down together, rolled, came up against a stack of carriers just as the ceiling section dropped. It hit where Ghost had been standing, a sound like thunder, dust and snow exploding outward. In the chaos, Elias lost his grip, lost track of Ghost, lost sight of Atlas. The world had gone white and dark at the same time, full of particles that made breathing hard and seeing impossible. His lungs burned, his eyes watered, and somewhere in the destruction, 2 animals he'd tried to save were now lost in conditions that would kill them long before rescue arrived. He tried to stand. Couldn't. Tried to call out. Couldn't find the breath. Tried to think past the ringing in his ears and the cold that was seeping through his jacket and the certainty that he'd just failed again. Failed like he'd failed Derek. Failed when it mattered most. Something moved in the white. A shape, small, 3-legged. Atlas emerged from the debris like a ghost, limping but mobile. Alive. And instead of running for the exit, for safety, for the escape every wild instinct should have been screaming for, it did something impossible. It started digging, pawing at the snow and debris with its good front leg, frantic, determined. Digging toward where Ghost had fallen, where the wolf was buried under snow that was piling up faster than any creature could clear. Elias understood then. Understood what Dr. Chen had missed. What Sarah Winters couldn't account for in her regulations and assessments. Atlas wasn't damaged by connection. It was defined by it. Had learned that survival meant more than saving yourself. Meant saving the ones who mattered. He crawled forward, joined Atlas in the digging. Together, human and animal, They cleared snow and debris, pulled away wood and metal, fought against the storm that was trying to bury everything. And finally, impossibly, they found Ghost. Unconscious, bleeding from a gash on his head, but breathing. The building groaned. More ceiling was coming. Elias knew they had maybe seconds. He grabbed Ghost, felt Atlas press against his leg in what might have been trust or might have been shared desperation. They moved for the exit, through white, through cold, through destruction that had turned a sanctuary into a tomb. They made it into the hallway just as the rest of the recovery ward's roof collapsed behind them. The door slammed shut from the force of the collapse. The hallway went silent except for their breathing. 3 survivors in a darkened corridor, all of them bleeding, all of them broken in different ways, all of them alive because they'd chosen each other over safety. Outside, through the window, Elias could see the storm still raging. See Sarah Winter's vehicle already gone, the inspector having evacuated with the rest of the staff because staying was suicidal. See the white world that would keep them trapped here until it decided to show mercy. He looked down at Atlas. The kitten met his eyes, held his gaze. And in that moment, Elias knew Sarah had been wrong. This animal wasn't unfit for life. It was more fit than most. Had chosen sacrifice over survival. Had chosen connection over instinct. Had proven that broken things could still be brave. Now they just had to stay alive long enough for anyone to know it. The main building was 500 yards away. In good weather, an easy walk. In a blizzard with wind speeds pushing 60 miles an hour and visibility down to nothing, it might as well have been on another planet. Elias stood at the door, looking out at white chaos. Ghost was too injured to walk on his own. Atlas was a 3-legged bobcat barely healed from its own trauma. And Elias himself was running on adrenaline that was already starting to fade, leaving behind the reality of a body that had been hit, strained, and pushed past reasonable limits. The smart move was to hunker down, wait for the storm to pass, wait for rescue. But the building had no heat, no power, no supplies. They'd freeze long before anyone could reach them. The only chance was to move. Now, while they still could. He wrapped Ghost in his jacket, feeling the cold hit his skin immediately. The wolf was heavier than he looked, dead weight in his arms. Atlas pressed against his leg, the kitten's body heat barely registering through his jeans. Together, they stepped into the storm. The wind hit like a physical force. Elias staggered, caught himself, pushed forward. He couldn't see the main building, couldn't see anything beyond 5 feet. Just white and more white, and the knowledge that if he went the wrong direction, they'd all die out here and nobody would find them until spring. 20 yards in, his arms started shaking. Ghost was heavy. Too heavy. Elias's shoulder, the one that had taken the beam hit, was screaming. His hands had gone numb. The cold was working its way through his body with a thoroughness that reminded him of other cold, other storms. Other times he'd thought he might not make it. Atlas stayed close, not running, not seeking shelter, just matching his pace. A small shape in his peripheral vision that kept him oriented, kept him moving. The kitten shouldn't have been helping. Should have bolted for cover, for survival, for anything that made sense in terms of wild animal behavior. Instead, it was choosing to stay. Choosing him, choosing Ghost, choosing connection over every instinct that said alone was safer. 50 yards. Elias's legs were starting to fail. The shaking had spread from his arms to his core. Hypothermia. He recognized the signs from his firefighting days, knew what came next. Confusion, poor judgment, the fatal urge to lie down and rest. He'd seen men die from cold, watched them make decisions that seemed reasonable in the moment, but were just the brain shutting down, protecting itself by giving up. He kept walking, one foot, then the other. Ghost was a burden he couldn't drop. Atlas was a presence he couldn't lose. And the distance to safety was measured in yards that felt like miles. The memories came then, uninvited, inevitable. Derek's voice on the radio, the static, the moment of hesitation that stretched into eternity. Elias could hear it again, clear as it had been 3 years ago. Could feel the weight of the choice, the paralysis of trying to be certain when certainty was impossible. "Brennan, what's the call?" "We stay or we move." 3 seconds. That's all it had taken. 3 seconds of Elias trying to read smoke patterns, trying to predict fire behavior, trying to be right instead of being decisive. And in those 3 seconds, Derek's window had closed. The fire had jumped. And 3 men had died screaming into radios that couldn't help them. Elias stumbled, went down to one knee. Ghost rolled from his arms. The wolf landed in snow that was already over a foot deep and still falling. Elias tried to get up, couldn't. His body was done. His will was still there. But will meant nothing when the machinery stopped responding. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in fire like Derek, but in cold, in failure, in the final proof that he'd never been good enough, never been fast enough, never been worth the trust people placed in him. Something touched his face. Warm, rough, insistent, Atlas. The kitten was standing on his chest, one paw pressed against his cheek, eyes locked on his. Not asking, demanding. Get up, move, fight. The message was clear, even without words. We're not done. Don't you dare quit now. Elias felt something crack in his chest. Not breaking. Breaking open. The kind of release that comes when you've been holding something too tight for too long and finally let it go. Derek was gone. Had been gone for 3 years. Nothing Elias did now would change that. No amount of guilt would bring him back. No amount of penance would rewrite history. The only question left was whether Elias was going to let that failure define him, or whether he was going to choose to show up for the things that were still here, still alive, still depending on him. He pushed himself up. Atlas jumped down, moved to Ghost, began digging at the snow around the wolf. Not just clearing it, working with purpose, with determination, showing Elias where to focus, what to do, how to move the injured animal when human hands weren't enough. They worked together. Man and Bobcat, survivor and survivor. 2 broken things that had learned the only way through was forward. Elias got Ghost up, got him moving, got his arms around the wolf again, even though his shoulders screamed and his back threatened to give out. Atlas led the way, staying visible, staying close, providing direction when the storm tried to turn them around. 100 yards, 200. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only the next step, the next breath. The next moment of choosing to continue when stopping would have been easier. The main building appeared through the white like a miracle. Lights in the windows, warmth waiting inside, safety that had seemed impossible 5 minutes ago. Elias hit the door with his shoulder. It swung open. Heat rushed out to meet them. Dr. Chen was there, and Linda, and Martha. All of them staring at the snow-covered man and wolf and Bobcat that shouldn't have survived the crossing, shouldn't have made it, shouldn't have been standing there at all. Jesus Christ, Chen breathed. You actually did it. Elias set Ghost down. The wolf was unconscious again, but breathing. Atlas sat next to him, refusing to move, refusing to leave its companion, even now that safety had been reached. The kitten was exhausted, soaked, shivering, but its eyes were clear, alert, alive in a way they hadn't been since the trap. He needs medical attention, Elias managed through chattering teeth. Gash on his head. Possible concussion. Internal injuries, maybe. Chen was already moving, already gathering supplies, already falling into the rhythm of emergency care. Martha appeared with blankets. Linda brought hot coffee that Elias wrapped his numb hands around but couldn't feel. Through the window, he could see the storm still raging. See the path they'd just crossed that was already invisible under fresh snow. See the collapsed building where they'd almost died. Where they should have died. Where 3 creatures who had no business surviving had decided survival was worth fighting for. Sarah called. Linda said quietly. She's stuck at a hotel in town. Said the transfer is postponed until weather clears. Elias looked at Atlas. The kitten looked back. Something passed between them that went beyond words or understanding. Something that said the storm had bought them time. That maybe, just maybe, they'd earned more than time. Maybe they'd earned a chance. Good, Elias said. His voice was rough. His body was done. But his mind was clearer than it had been in 3 years. We're going to need it. Because they'd proven something today. Not just that they could survive. That they could survive together. That broken didn't mean useless. That connections made you stronger, not weaker. That Sarah Winters and her regulations had missed the most important thing about wild animals. They adapted. They evolved. They became what they needed to be. And Atlas had become something extraordinary. Sarah Winters returned 3 days after the storm. By then, the story had spread. Local news had picked it up. Man and Bobcat saved blind wolf in building collapse. The kind of feel-good piece that played well on morning television. But Sarah wasn't interested in human interest stories. She came with her clipboard and her regulations and the transfer paperwork that had only been delayed, not canceled. She found Elias in the temporary recovery area, watching Atlas and Ghost sleep side by side on a pile of donated blankets. The kitten's paw was draped across the wolf's neck. Both of them looked like they'd been through a war. Both of them looked like they'd won. I've read the reports, Sarah said without preamble. Reviewed Dr. Chen's notes. Talked to the volunteers who witnessed the collapse. She paused. What you did was reckless. Could have gotten you killed. Could have, Elias agreed. Didn't. That animal, Sarah gestured at Atlas, should have run. Self-preservation is the most fundamental wild behavior. Instead, it stayed. Helped you dig out an injured wolf that wasn't even its species. That's not wild behavior, Mr. Brennan. That's learned behavior. Habituated behavior. Elias looked at her. Or it's evolved behavior. Something we haven't seen before because we've never given damaged animals the chance to show us what they're capable of. The regulations are clear. The regulations were written for animals that fit predictable patterns. Atlas doesn't fit. Never will. And maybe that's not a failure. Maybe that's something better. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its professional distance. I've been doing this job for 12 years, seen hundreds of cases, made hundreds of decisions. Most of them are straightforward. But this one, she looked at Atlas. This one keeps me up at night. Then change the decision. It's not that simple. It is that simple. You have the authority. Use it. Sarah pulled out a chair, sat down like the weight of what she was carrying had finally become too much. If I approve non-transfer, I need justification. Need documentation that the animal serves an educational or conservation purpose that outweighs the risk of permanent captivity. And I need a facility that can provide appropriate care and housing under department oversight. Elias felt something shift, not victory, Not yet, but possibility. What if we had both? Purpose and facility? I'm listening. Over the next hour, they talked. Dr. Chen joined them. Martha too. And slowly, piece by piece, an idea took shape. Not rehabilitation for release. Something different. Something that had never been tried at Cascade Hope, but maybe should have been all along. A therapeutic program. Veterans with PTSD working with rescued animals that had their own trauma. Mutual healing. Mutual purpose. The kind of connection that couldn't be prescribed or manufactured, but that happened naturally when broken things recognized each other. Atlas could be the cornerstone. A living example of resilience, of adaptation, of finding meaning beyond survival. And Ghost could stay too, providing the kind of calm presence that trauma survivors needed. The program wouldn't cure anyone, but it might give them what Elias had found here. A reason to keep showing up, a connection that mattered. Sarah listened, made notes, asked hard questions about logistics and liability and long-term sustainability. But she didn't say no. And in her silence, Elias heard the beginning of yes. 2 weeks later, the approval came through. Cascade Hope Wildlife Center would host the pilot program. Atlas and Ghost would remain as permanent residents, not as exhibits, but as partners. Veterans from across Oregon would be referred through VA services. Funding would come from grants and private donations. It was small. It was uncertain. But it was a chance. The program launched on a cold morning in March. 5 veterans showed up, all of them with the same hollowed-out look Elias recognized from his own mirror. All of them carrying weight that couldn't be seen, but felt all the same. They were skeptical, guarded, not sure what sitting with traumatized animals was supposed to accomplish. Then Atlas limped into the room, and something shifted. The veterans saw the scars, saw the missing leg, saw the way the kitten moved with purpose despite the damage. And they understood, not with words, but with the kind of recognition that only survivors share. Ghost followed, his blind eyes unseeing, but his presence calm. And when the first veteran, a man named James, who hadn't spoken more than 2 words since arriving, reached out to touch the wolf's fur, something happened. James's shoulders dropped, his breathing slowed, and after a moment, he started talking. About Afghanistan, about losing his squad, about the guilt that followed him home and never left. Atlas moved closer, sat next to James like it understood, like it knew what carrying that weight felt like. The other veterans watched, listened, and one by one, they began to share their own stories, their own scars, their own failed attempts to outrun the past. Elias stood in the doorway, watching it unfold. Martha appeared beside him, her cane tapping softly on the floor. "You did good," she said quietly. "Gave them something they couldn't find anywhere else." "Atlas did the work. I just opened the door." "You opened the door because Atlas opened yours first. That's how it works. Healing isn't something you do alone. It's something you do together." Spring came to Oregon the way it always did. Slow, tentative. The world turning green again after months of gray. The program grew, more veterans, more animals, more stories of broken things finding their way back to wholeness through connection instead of isolation. On a morning in late April, Elias drove to the ridge above the center. The place where he could see the valley spread out below, where the forest met the sky, where everything felt possible in a way it hadn't for 3 long years. He stood at the edge looking out over miles of Oregon wilderness. Behind him, his truck. Ahead, nothing but green and sky and the kind of peace that only came from finally letting go of what couldn't be changed. Atlas emerged from the truck cab and made its way to where Elias stood. The kitten moved easier now, confident on 3 legs, scars healed into just another part of its story. It climbed onto a boulder, then, with a small jump, landed on Elias's shoulder. They stood there together, man and Bobcat, looking at the same view. Elias thought about Derek, about the fire, about 3 seconds that had defined 3 years. And for the first time, he could think about it without the crushing weight of failure. Derek was gone, would always be gone. But his death didn't have to define everything that came after. Didn't have to be the end of Elias's ability to show up, to connect, to matter. Atlas's claws dug gently into his jacket. The kitten's warmth settled against his neck. And Elias realized something that should have been obvious, but had taken this long to understand. He hadn't saved Atlas. They'd saved each other, had given each other a reason to keep trying when trying seemed pointless, had proven that surviving meant more than just breathing. It meant finding something worth staying alive for. The wind shifted. Somewhere below, in the valley where the center sat, Ghost would be resting in the sun. Veterans would be arriving for their sessions, carrying burdens they couldn't name but that animals understood anyway. Dr. Chen would be reviewing treatment plans. Martha would be making coffee and offering wisdom nobody asked for but everyone needed. It was small, it was imperfect, but it was real, and real was enough. Elias put his hand up, let Atlas nuzzle against his palm. The kitten purred, a sound he'd never heard from it before. A sound that meant contentment, safety, home. "We did all right," Elias said quietly. "Didn't we?" Atlas didn't answer, didn't need to. The answer was in the way it stayed, in the way it trusted, in the way 2 broken things had looked at each other across impossible distance and decided the gap was worth crossing. The past was still there, would always be there. But it didn't own them anymore. They'd found their way forward, not by forgetting, not by fixing what couldn't be fixed, but by choosing every single day to show up for something bigger than their own pain. The forest stretched out before them, vast and green and full of life that kept trying despite everything. And somewhere in that wilderness, between the scars and the hope, between the loss and the finding, 2 survivors stood together and looked toward the future without flinching. They were broken. They were healing. They were enough. And for the first time in a long time, that was everything. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us we're never too broken to matter. Elias, Atlas, and Ghost found their way back from the edge, not by forgetting their scars, but by finding others who understood them. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been saved by an unexpected friendship? Maybe a pet that came into your life right when you needed it most, or a time when helping someone else helped you heal. Drop a comment below and share your story. I read every single one, and your experiences matter. And if this story touched your heart, there are so many more waiting for you here. Stories of second chances, unlikely heroes, and the incredible bonds between humans and animals that change everything. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next journey. Because these stories, they're about all of us. About finding hope when the world feels dark. About discovering that broken things can still be beautiful. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, no matter what you've been through, you're not alone. There's always a reason to keep going. Sometimes you just need someone to show you what that reason is. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other.